Hello, everyone. It's Francis, Martin, and Curt from the Natural Law Institute. This is what is it? Friday, April 4th, 2025. This is our office hours Q&A session where you get to submit your questions, and then we answer them. Usually they're read by Francis. Martin has gone through and answered them, and then I try to add color, and which ends up meaning I talk twice as long. Anyway, we really enjoy these sessions. We've produced a couple of hundred, more than a couple of hundred now, of answers.
200. Well, if about 250. Let's put it that way.
That's pretty good. All right. And your answers are your questions are usually quite good. So let's continue.
Yes, and we are only about a month behind now.
Really?
Which means the question you ask now, we'll get to answer them by May or something.
Well, that's consistent.
Yes.
Every time we finish, we're about a month behind.
Because our audience keeps on giving us new questions, which is awesome. All right, shall we start with question 1? Okay,
yes.
Question 1 from Lockpo. For Martin, given the illiberal tendencies of the DR to a point where even classical liberalism is opposed, actual classical liberalism, not conservatism from the 1980s, what do you view the position of classical liberalism as it was practiced, and how do you reconcile it with DR and a lesser extent NLI thought? I don't know what DR means.
Well, I view classical liberalism as functioning for a time thanks to being constrained by... I view classical liberalism as functioning for a time thanks to being constrained by nationalism and running on steam of pre-liberal values that the liberal system itself couldn't and didn't defend, and without taking away the blame of people involved in the slow transition to where we are today, in some respects it was inevitable development. So while even a year ago I might have still called our effort a kind of racist liberalism, I've since moved away from that entirely. I don't see a problem reconciling this with NLI work at all. What you may mean is that Curt calls himself a classical liberal. That Curt calls himself a classical liberal. Well, it's apparently up to me to demonstrate he's in error.
I wish I had understood originally. Now I understand for the value for the audience. It's better when you have people who don't completely agree on a talk show, right? Because then you don't get parroting. But I don't necessarily disagree with Martin's criticism of me. I disagree with thinking it's, to me, I think it's the difference between I'm trying to do a science bounded by evolutionary computation, and I see Martin as applying that science to given circumstances. And I think that's correct, and I think stating that for the audience is wonderful. In the sense of classical liberalism, I take that to mean the English invention of the modern rule of law state. And so I consider under the then understood combination of the common law as a process and the natural law as the means of decidability. And I see that more fully founded in the U.S. Constitution than it is because it's declared and stated and written, and then in the habitual Constitution of the traditional unwritten Constitution of the English. So and so I don't know what is DR, Martin? Do you know what DR is?
Dissident Right.
Oh,
Okay.
So my problem with the dissident right isn't that they're wrong. It's that their attempt to that no one would ever let them have power anywhere.
Well,
Uh,
I think the problem is it's the hammer and nail problem. If the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem you see is a nail. And you cover this as much in the Civil War and Revolution presentation. It's the solution that dissident right tend to have is very singular, which is why nobody
No
will let them have power.
but
if you need somebody else to let you have power, then that's who actually has power, not you.
that's not the issue. The issue is what you're gonna how is there a difference between being correct about complaining and being correct, in other words, your complaint, and being correct about that these problems need to be cured, and then saying, well, are you the kind of people we want to have running the show to clear those problems? I would say, yeah, because that's what humans do. They bring in people who assert power in times of crisis, and they push them out in times of peace. And so that's a normal human behaviors we're observing. My problem with the right is that the right is that the dissident right is, I don't believe they'll show up. In other words, I think it's all talk. And so it's not, that's my real criticism. It isn't that they're wrong. It isn't that their solutions aren't probably reasonably good. It's just that the solutions they're offering can't bring them into power, and they don't show up enough to obtain power. So the whiny, I just think of it as being whiny bitches. That's the complaint. It's not that they're wrong or even their ideas are that bad. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the dissident right contains the people that do the deepest thinking. It's certainly they've outlasted the libertarians. I'm not complaining about that. I'm complaining about the fact that it's not they don't show up. I always get it, which aggravates me, obviously.
Oh, sure, so I think that's separate from the question.
Yes. Which is why I say I don't really disagree with you.
Because I think that that's just normal human nature when nobody would show up. Nobody would show up. Left only shows up because they can get away with it.
Yes.
They have regime on their side.
Yep. Okay.
Wow, that's like the shortest answer for question one ever.
Well,
usually question one lasts an hour.
It's a clear answer. I mean, Martin answered it. I mean, and I think and for me, it's an easy question. What's your view on the classical liberalism, and how do you reconcile it with the dissident right? And I'm like, okay, well, that's a pretty easy question. In fact, we discuss it all the time. So.
Yeah, I was just making an observation.
No, okay.
All right, question 2 from Lucas. Thank you for your efforts, Edmund. 1, I would like to hear your thoughts on the socio-economic and political situation, life environment in the next 5 to 10 years of the Czech Republic and, broadly speaking, Europe. I suspect Martin could have a great deal of insight. 2, do you plan, beyond your general magnum opus, to give more attention to Europe in the future?
I mostly think over what's going on in the West as a whole. The fate of Czechia is largely tied to that rather than having its independent destiny. So I know less about what's going on locally than you might expect. But at the level of Europe, it would appear we're witnessing splitting of Europe from America, and by we, especially countries to the west and north of us, are still run by colonial administrators beholden to the old American ideology. In the best case scenario, we can hope for their replacement with realistic leaders We want to view Europe as economic zone for globalists or as extension of America, but start assessing our own national and geopolitical interests. The clowns currently in place are more interested in doubling down on wokeness, mass migration, and continuing America's proxy war even when America itself is pulling out. I really can't predict much with certainty. There's an indication that populists may win next election here, but that doesn't mean much. Populists across Europe haven't been able or willing to implement necessary changes, and in Western Europe, populism always comes packaged with Zionism.
Very well done.
So, explain that last part for me, if you will. Populism always comes packaged with Zionism. What historical precedents led you to make that conclusion?
Like all of the recent populists like Le Pen, Wilder, they always start talking about Israeli interests, more about actually national
Okay, so you mean the more recent flavor of populism? I was thinking more in the populism in the World War II era.
Yeah, recent. They're obviously always civic nationalists, which means not really nationalists, and not really resistance to what's going on.
Can I comment? Because I agree with you. My understanding of the situation is that Europeans are quite weak, and they are aware of their weak. And because the United States has been providing cover, they have been virtue signaling, meaning obtaining political power by the means that they can demonstrate they're better or special. And so I agree with Martin here, but that's precisely because they're taking this position because they're weak. And so there are two. That's the axis one is they're taking the position for weak. Axis two is that we've known for a long time that the population bomb is happening in Europe. I mean, we thought it was going to go the other way in the 70s, but by 1990, it was clear the opposite was true. So by 2000, I think, they put out that paper in Europe that we needed to have immigration to preserve our social net, which is their virtue signal, which is the virtue signal is a substitution for their weakness. And then in 2010, or somewhere around there, it's making the rounds again, but around 2010, we found out that immigrants are more costly than they are beneficial in Europe. And it's not a little, it's a lot. I mean, if you think about it as the average person, if you average it out across the population, can produce like a 20% surplus. That's all you can do. It's actually just a physical law. In other words, I haven't done the work on this to be sure, but I'm pretty sure it's a physical law that a human being can only produce an energy surplus of around 20% on average, right? Which is made possible only because of our capture of either animal energy or human energy by organizing, animal energy, right, for doing some manual tasks, and hydrocarbon energy for doing more complex tasks driven by electricity.
That's why I'm a little confused, because if that were true, then we shouldn't see in other words, if surplus energy production is just around 20% or so, then we shouldn't see much difference in pre-industrial versus post-industrial ages.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's compounding though. And so no, because demand for all the infrastructure and demand for the cost, as we've seen with industrial society, the cost of goods, demand for government services drives it up to the point where there's still only 20% surplus. So it's sort of like you get bigger.
But
Right?
sorry, what's the input? When you say 20% surplus, what is it based off of? What's the denominator?
Returns on returns on the application of energy, and the application and the capture, transformation, application, and extraction.
Oh,
Of
I see what you mean. So yeah, in that sense, pre-industrial societies, the capture of energy is very limited because you're
That's
limited
right.
to just human, whatever we eat and whatever animals eat and so on. Post-industrial, you tap into potential energy trapped into chemical bonds,
For us,
so
and
that
yeah,
raises it by orders of magnitude.
yeah, but then what we do is we raise the bar. You
Mm-hmm.
can't go back to subsistence farming anymore,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we raise the bar, so we're always staying in this 20% surplus.
Mm-hmm.
We're raising the bar, which is which is the whole goal, right? The 20% surplus and continuing it, or which we call growth, is the carrot. The stick is we're never fucking happy, and that's why, because we're never fucking happy, because uh, no creature can survive without having what we would call status signaling as sortition criteria for reproduction, which is why the world is the world of reproduction is falling apart. Um. Anyway, so if I've made my, tell me if I made my point clear. Then, Francis, I'm not sure.
Yeah, now I get what you mean by 20%. I think, in simple terms, all I can understand is, although we've now captured more energy and produced more surplus in terms of energy, we also raised our own expectations.
Yeah, and it's sort of like the means to produce the surpluses. You know how I literally view it. You ever have a hamster or a pet? Of course, you don't. You have things that eat hamsters. But
Right.
anyway, but when I was growing up, I had like a hamster and a guinea pig and a rabbit, and a dog. But when you have these little fucking rodent things, they like to run on those little wheels.
Mm-hmm.
And I always think of the state of the civilization as just running on a wheel, right? Running on a wheel and so what you end up with is the the wheels have momentum, but they have to be kept going, and
Right.
that consumes energy, right, to keep this thing going. So it might be true that going faster produces more innovation, or in other words, you could think of as more coverage of time and space, which is not really what it does. Is more going faster it literally does produce more coverage of time and space, so it decreases all your opportunity costs almost infinitely. But the same thing is, in order to keep running faster, you have to burn more energy,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's just evolution. It's the beauty of being human is we have the neural capacity to remember, recognize patterns, predict and adapt dynamically, and so we can make the freaking spinning squirrel wheel or whatever it is, hamster wheel run faster. We can make it run faster, basically almost eternally. But we have to maintain the momentum. Once you break momentum, you have contractions, which are usually used for error correction, and if you don't, you have depressions, and if you don't solve that, you have collapses. So you got to keep the hamster wheel running. I actually think that's people's most disappointing feature of modernity, is the faster we go, the more adaptation they're subject to, the more they have to worry about more. And that's why you've seen movements in the past for a simpler life.
Return to land and Amish and so on.
Yeah.
It's almost like the pursuit of happiness is a terrible goal for society.
Well, nature doesn't care whether you're happy. Nature just cares whether you survive.
It's actually status signaling.
But ultimately, if we stay on this rock, then we're all gonna die someday.
Yeah, it's actually status signaling. So status signaling drives the initial part of the competition, and then the people at the bottom and the farthest behind, it's actually being left behind.
Mm-hmm.
And so essentially, it's all status signaling, which is not fun when you think about it. It's enough to make me a hippie, for Christ's sake. It's not fun if I think about it too long. But then, what are we going to do? Kill off 90% of the population?
I mean, what can I say? Mother Nature is a bitch, so
Yeah,
you got to keep on outrunning the Red Queen, or she can't wrestle with you. So what can you do?
Well, we don't like to talk. We talk about the plague as being a horrible thing, but it was actually extraordinarily beneficial for everyone who survived.
Yeah, it made labor
incredibly
valued again.
And so, I've sort of seen this. I remember during the Cold War, especially during the 70s, right? The 70s sci-fi, right? It's all about nuclear war, right? And devastation and whatever. And so, you live with that crap every day in your head that you were going to be, incinerated, right? And live in a wasteland if you survived. And if you survive, you live in the wasteland while your body gradually fell apart from radiation poisoning. That's what we grew up thinking was going to happen. And so, but I partly think about that as that and the zombie apocalypse as wishing that the population, the subconscious, not wishing, subconscious identification that a collapse of the population would end this would restore some sense of normalcy by restoring the value of the individual. And I think these things are subconscious projections of our alienation as population increases sufficiently that we're narrowing we're making it so that people are less valuable. And of course, I see the advent of AI.
That's going to accelerate things. I mean, the scariest thing I saw yesterday was, well, scary, also amused, is this OnlyFans model on X that's basically saying, oh, well, I'm AI generated. Like you, I go to the gym. I was like, well, okay, OnlyFans model are going to be out of jobs soon.
And I was thinking about this. Excuse me, sneeze. It's going to hit the people who were the benefits of the technological innovation that began in the 70s and 80s, because that's where I made my money, right? I started making money right away from this crap. But you're employing people that would not be employable otherwise in the capacity that they're in. And I'm like, okay, so now what are we going to do with these fucking people once all these clerical workers who are actually, they get paid quite a bit of money because the momentum they're participating in other words, compressed time and space. And then all of a sudden they're bypassed, and they're bypassed like the weavers were in the UK, which caused the counter revolution against automation at the last time. So I see all these things working together to produce a very fascinating bit of chaos.
Learn a trade.
What?
Learn a trade.
Yeah, I mean, but then what are we going to do with it? We have to. You can learn a trade, and we can. There's like what is it? There's how many
Quite a few, like hundreds of thousands of unfilled blue-collar jobs or something like
that.
Yeah,
I think it's 700,000, I think, right? Of unfilled. They're not jobs that are bad, like.
Right. Electricians, plumbers, and
just CNC machine operators. People can program and work with automated machines, right? It's not even bad work, right? But I look out and I'm like, why does the town I grew up in had chestnut tree lined streets, right? Had beautiful Victorian homes. You went when we had a parade. We had the people run down your classical American Main Street, and marching bands, and the fire department, and ambulances, and the military came out, and the schools went out, and everybody did that stuff. And we all ended up in the Woodlawn Cemetery, which is basically a grand. It's like what's the park in New York City? Central Park. Basically, Central Park with headstones, right? I mean, gorgeous landscape visit places, and so we would all stand there among the headstones on, let's say, Memorial Day, and thank the people who came before us and whatever. And I'm thinking about the world. The world I grew up in was pretty, right? The world I live in today isn't. We live in one of the most affluent places in the world,
and it's actually kind of, it's like that modern art that saps that's your soul type of deal.
it's not ugly, but it sure as hell isn't pretty. So that's how I sort of see the whole problem. I see it as we're going to go through a very interesting intersection of all these issues, and it'll be as disruptive as the Industrial Revolution. It'll just be disruptive for the what do you call it, the clerical class, which is, see, there's two kinds of middle class. There's economic middle class, and there's economic upper middle class. But when some of that class shift is due to the compensation for being able to work with computers, which is no longer going to be a viable way of working. And so it's going to be sort of like you're shifted downward in your employability, because there won't be none of that. All that work is actually as trivial as the farm work became in today. I mean, farm work is what, 1 or 2% of the population today? I think it's less than 2% now, right? Whereas it was for most of, even at the turn of the century, it was still 50% of the population. Last century, not this one. So I think it's going to be a very interesting world with the curse of may you be living in interesting times, right? It's going to be interesting. I think there's 30 years of. I think that unless AI or something of that nature compensates for it, would take one of two things: energy or AI. The only two things I know of. I think if those two things don't carry us, it's about a 30-year, a generation long, 25-year to 30-year generational adjustment pattern, and it's going to largely suck. Right. So I'm hoping AI is the promise, because I'd rather deal with the disruption like that than in other words, disruption like that than I would have the disruption just be the collapse of world systems of patterns of trade, because that's the other invention that's happening right now, which is we need to reorder the cost of paying for the system of international financial transport.
Yeah, I saw your article on X. Basically, Trump is saying, let's deal with this rather than paying a long term. Let's deal with in a way of a shock or whatever, and get it over with within his term.
Proactive shock rather than a.
I think Trump probably fears not that he fears anything, but he's concerned about a Japan-style 3-decade, a whole generation fall, where you just have asset deflation and then popular immiseration. Whereas Japan, being a homogenized society, they can more or less deal with that. In a non-homogenized society like the United States and most of the West, we're going to have civil wars.
Yeah. Just to say that people don't think. See, the problem is, if you read these stupid fucking academic articles, right, or that are written by the people on Trump's team, who am I thinking of right now from Hudson? This guy from Hudson.
Bassett?
Huh?
The Bassett, the Treasury Secretary?
I can't remember his name. It's probably him. I don't see his name on here. Stefan
Oh
Muir.
yeah, I was thinking that's the other guy I was thinking.
Right.
He's got a weird
So,
last name.
yes, exactly. So, you look at this guy, and, he's a Harvard
Hmm.
PhD, and he's really, I mean, I've read enough of this guy's stuff. He's no fucking slouch,
Hmm.
right? And he can reduce it to he can reduce stuff to, college level educated uh, uh, writing. In other words, you can read his stuff, and it's not like it's inaccessible. So people like have this, which really kills me. Think this idea like Trump is making this up by himself. He's not. He's frustrated by what he sees as people taking advantage of America,
Hmm.
but and it's really bothering not only his moral sensitivities, but certainly his loyalty sensitivities to the people, and so he's finding the people that know what to do, and so he's put these folks together, and I wish they would do a better job of communicating this, but they have taken the position of staying with the moral and emotional argument as much as possible without going into details.
What you mean? They are staying with the moral, emotional.
What's her name? Who's the press secretary chick, the blonde chick that I have a crush on? His secretary.
I know what you're talking about. The face. I just can't remember her name.
She's a hot shit. I mean, and she's right on message, and so she's making a moral and righteous argument all the time. But if you asked her to go into explaining, Doctor whatever has said blah 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 blah, she would not be able to maintain the emotional level of her discourse. And so I understand what they're doing. They always make it moral because that's what works.
Yeah, it worked for the masses.
Right, but underneath it doesn't mean that underneath it isn't good research and science. So there is.
I think we went way off the path from this original question.
I forgot what the question was.
Well, the question.
I of course view it as absurd to call not paying enough into a protection racket freeloading.
I couldn't get that, Martin. Say again.
So I view it as absurd to call not paying enough into a protection racket freeloading.
Okay. All right. So, all right. So
well, there's one question you have not answered. This is part 2 of the question. That do you plan, meaning you, Curt, beyond your general magnum opus, the books that are currently in flight, to give more attention to Europe in the future?
Yes. My thought was that things are changing so fast. It's kind of hard for us to keep up with them at this point. We had the luxury of time before, we no longer do. In my understanding, we'd originally said it was easier to make a change here in the United States than it would be in Europe. But because of the strategy Trump is taking, it's causing Europe to make a change. The problem is it's empowering the liberals instead of the conservatives. And so I don't expect that to continue, but I think that's a just criticism. His argument is, of course, you got to carry your water, and we're not carrying it anymore, and because Europe aren't going to help us with the China problem like we help you with the Russia problem. You're not going to do that. And so we have to have our resources available for the China problem. And so that's the tactic he's taking. The Europeans and Canadians are all acting like pissy girls right now, which is I understand completely, but it's avoiding the choice that whether you take Martin's position or mine, that the U.S. has been carrying their water for at the expense of our people and our economy for so long.
And our people too.
Yes, well, okay, I'll agree. Yeah, but they're carrying your people because because like I mentioned earlier, is they because they're weak, they go with virtue signaling instead.
But then they don't even let us become strong because that's fascism.
We've been trying to make Europe get strong since 1990, maybe even before that. The minute we recognized that the European recoveries happened, which was really the ascent of German manufacturing, we said you guys got to carry your weight, and nobody would fucking do it.
Well, up until the dissolution of Soviet Union, Germany kind of did, right?
Correct.
If not in manpower, at least in terms of military hardware and so on. It's just that afterwards they're so busy with the what do you call it? With the reunification, they basically says, to hell with all these military spending and so on. We're just going to need to absorb it.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm disagreeing with mostly with the French, right? The French and the virtue signaling. Meanwhile, they're the ones that still have their colonies. They're the ones that are advancing invasion by Islam. They're the ones that are advancing the feminine strategy and I'm like, you guys are as bad as the fucking Russians, except you're seditious by claiming you're on our side, right? And meanwhile, we're artificially suppressing the Germans, who really are the ones who are capable of being the thought leadership of Europe.
Well, that was the purpose of NATO. What was that saying? To keep America in, Russians out, and Germany down.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Yes, that is right.
Pretty much, except that framing of ran out of usefulness, by the 1990s.
Oh, fuck, it ran out of it by the 1950s. So late 50s.
That's still what elites ruling the West wish for.
Yes, I understand.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just like science. Science advances by like one tombstone at a time. These sclerosis thinking elites advance by like one tombstone at a time. What's the guy's name? The bearded guy that was in first Trump's administration with glasses. He was basically educated in the Cold War frame, and he still thinks the world in the Cold War frame.
Right, which you see a lot. You have people in the Cold War frame. You have people in the 90s frame. And you have the population saying, "Fuck that, we're done." Right? You built This is where Martin is right. You've built an empire that is more interested in imperial actions than domestic. And Trump came along and said, "I'm going to be more interested in domestic than imperial, and so I'm going to put America first." I mean, it's not fucking there's no rocket science here. It's just normal human behavior. People pursue the interests that they've entrenched themselves in. Sorry, Martin, I cut you off.
The mainstream Cold War wasn't correct in the first place. It's both sides controlled by the same people.
Well, I don't know. I think that's a spin, Martin. I mean, I grew up in that shit, and it was not funny. There's nothing like the constant and justified fear of nuclear war, and just the little bit of it that's creeped back it's a drop in the bucket compared to how we used to think about it. It was something you worried about every day.
I'm not suggesting it was pleasant for the people. Of course, they were supposed to think of Russians as the enemy, and vice versa.
I don't know how to.
Well, let me conclude this question by asking a question. Do you think there's a way for Europe to get out of this without becoming an American vassal state?
It's done.
Becoming?
Continue to be American vassal states.
I think it's done. I mean, the next generation, the next administration might try to reverse it somehow. But once you tell a people, we're not going to back you,
Mm-hmm.
you need to make it on your own, and that puts the little fear of God in you. They tend not to go back so easily. I don't think the NATO alliance will, or some version of it will not restore, because America and Europe have too many common interests. But and certainly the Five Eyes are going to have their interest even once the Canadians get over their
The Five Eyes.
Five Eyes is the organization, this intelligence and
Oh,
military
I see.
sharing organization
Yeah,
by the Anglo-Canadians.
Europe needs to get out of that. I
Huh?
don't want to be spied on by America.
No, Europe isn't in it. It's England, Canada, the U.S.,
Right.
Australia, England, Canada, U.S., Australia, New Zealand, and and we treat Japan as extended
That's a
family.
near ally. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so do we answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
All right. Question 3. What's the optimal criteria to decide if someone is an NPC?
And the term has been used in various senses, and I'm not even sure about the. Not sure what I was trying to say here. Anyway, one sense that has been for those that lack inner voice and/or inner vision, which is apparently a substantial part of the population. More common sense is someone who operates largely or entirely on signaling and lacks the ability to independently evaluate whether a position is true or false whenever it is affected by social approval. This is not a binary but a spectrum, but recent events have clearly demonstrated the majority of people are much less capable of original thought than we used to think. The test for this is simply talking to them about any unpopular position and seeing whether they simply repeat a narrative of their dominant social context.
Because an NPC is referred to in a video game where characters you interact with follow a script. They actually have no mind, they have no brain. They just pattern response to certain queries. So so what's the question again?
What's the optimal criteria to decide if someone is an NPC?
When they go to when they're just citing parroting the narrative, what's called the gated institutional narrative, it's that you can tell immediately. Oh, it's like when they say, well, that's mighty white of you, or that's racist, or that's what I mean. Whenever they come up with the slogans, that's just NPC wear.
Or that's anti-Semitic.
There you go. There's another one.
Oh, I guess the people burning and vandalizing Teslas, they're NPCs.
They're classifying them as terrorists now, which I think is awesome.
Yeah. Well, I'm just waiting for open season so I can actually put my ARs to use.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways. Oh, what was I going to say? It dawned on me that you can drive around in a Tesla with swastikas painted on the side, and people are going to be okay with that because it's being vandalized. And I swear to God, one of these pictures of the swastika on the Tesla I saw was actually the clockwise swastika, which is a Buddhist symbol, versus they didn't know that the Nazi swastika is a counter. It just blows my mind.
I just thought of that name. You can now ride around in a Tesla with swastikas and people will just believe it was vandalized and let you do it.
I think the earliest that I was made aware just about the symbolism was back in the days. I was on an exchange program in Japan, and there were some Europeans with us, and we went and visited the Japanese temple, and of course, for the Buddha right here, right, there's a swastika symbol, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, this is a bad sign in Europe." And then I told her, "Well, you should probably read more history
culture.
and more symbolism." All right, shall we move to the next question?
I think this is a hard one.
Okay, I finally got my chance. I've been waiting in queue for like 2 months. So this question is for me. What would it take for civilization to unanchor itself from its founding institutions and adopt another strategy? Example, China from a state centricity to adopt rule of law. Does it require changes in social contract, geopolitical reality, genetics of the populace, or all of the above and more?
I've thought about this quite a bit, and I've prepared an answer. And now I'm giving the answer as if civilizations. I'm probably giving the answer much closer to being Islam versus East Asia. In other words, I'm probably going to make this answer sound that it's more work than it is, because when I was thinking of it, I said, how do you come from really far behind? Like, I mean, China was doing fine. Right? China was doing fine until the CCP got afraid. I mean, what has happened? The day that Poland votes itself out of communism is the day that the Chinese Party cracked down on Tiananmen Square. Right?
Oh, is that?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
And so that's not going to happen here. I mean, they saw what happened to Russia, to the Soviet Union. They don't want that to happen here. But then they went around and created their economic miracle, so to speak. Even if half of it was fake, it wasn't. It was clear that at least in my intellectual circles, it was like, look, the fucking Chinese are in the diaspora are as successful as his shoes. So I mean, there's nothing wrong with Chinese people and their culture. The problem's the government. And so if we get the people the people have the opportunity, they'll go like crazy with capitalism. And so they did. The people did fantastic. The problem isn't the capacity. In other words, there's different problems. One is the initiative to build economic prosperity. Right. Some cultures are so low trust they can't do it. That's certainly Islam. They can't build a corporation. Is why the same reason they can't build an army. Right. Whereas that's not a problem in a lot of other countries, right? They just need rule of law and credit availability, and they'll do fine, right? So the problem becomes when you move from I'm taking responsibility for myself, my family, and whatever organization I belong to, right? And I'm taking responsibility for the state and all of the fucking conflict that arises from that stuff. And so when I look at the best, arguably the best country in the world is Japan, because they actually are the most socialist, but they're also the most democratic, the most socialist. They have exceptional rule of law, but they're profoundly fucking moral. So the problems in that much of the world has to deal with don't exist there. In other words, people behave people, when given the opportunity to be responsible for the full spectrum of self, family, community, or organization, community, and state, the people actually take that responsibility without trying to cheat or get too much corruption or whatever.
Hmm.
And so I look at, could that happen in China? Well, I mean, if you weren't having these 100 million princes or whatever there are out there, people in the party who get so many benefits from it at the expense of the rest of the population. Well, maybe, but that's a
But
large.
that's why that's one of the reasons I asked this question. And you brought up Japan, which I thought was brilliant. The princelings and so on, the princeling problem in China, I see that as a symptom of essentially a natural evolution of just a natural result of the way systems structured. When you have a state-centric system and it's so ingrained into the entire civilization, inevitably you're going to have the emperors and bad emperor problems. And along with the emperors and bad emperors, you have princelings and good princelings and bad princelings and so on. And I haven't thought of Japan, and thank you for bringing it up. I thought Japan adopted much of its civilizational guiding principle from China because it developed later. So it must have, I don't know for sure, but I would think that it started as a pretty state-centric society as well. Maybe desperate states, because during the Sengoku period, I mean, you had the daimyos and the shogunate that they basically fought each other.
Yeah, it's more feudal. The feudal, it is more feudal than state-centric.
Oh, I see. Because there's no unifying river system in Japan.
Correct.
That can unify the country,
Right.
and so it's in that sense, Japan in the Middle Ages is more similar to Europe in the Middle Ages, where you have lords, manorialism, and so on. Okay, I see. That's a fundamental difference.
So the people, it's not like, you have the different groups in Europe. It's more like you have the different groups in Europe. Like, if there's some parts of the world where one group is naturally very hostile to tribal, it's almost tribal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, compared to another. And so there's a persistent antagonism just by proximity, right? And then you have things like where in Europe and in Japan, where you're really just competing over who can get since land is the only thing that produces wealth, you're competing over who can hold the territory that allows them to concentrate the wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not like you hate your neighbor. It's more like business, right? And so you got this ability to maintain, I guess, a national identity or a national interest.
Or more of a civilizational identity, not so much a national identity.
You're right. Civilizational identity, because you can be at war with this group this month and be at war and be an ally with them next month, right? And so that breeds a very different culture underneath it, which is one of reconciliation, right? And it really is, war is business, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. There's some wars politics, but even then, war is just politics because politics is just business, right? And this is the problem with industrialism, is that there's no real reason to have war anymore if you can just have trade. It's kind of stupid. I mean, why do you want someone else? Why do you need to rule someone else when as long as there's a trade network? Because land doesn't matter anymore. The only reason you'd want a war with somebody is if they won't sell you shit. right? Or they hold you
Or
hostage.
they consistently take advantage of you in trade
Yes,
interactions,
right.
But
despite.
then you don't respect their self-determination if you expect to just have to sell you what they have.
Mm,
They have self-determination, that means they get to keep it if they want.
that's yeah. I suppose I don't want to go down there, but that right there is the crux of the issue we need to solve between our discourses. Is that it's your self-determination uh, when you're talking about a resource like water or air or in the past, in the not too recent past, iron and coal, or in the ancient world, um, uh, what is the other metal of bronze?
Tin.
Copper,
Tin.
tin, tin. So if you need tin, right? Um, that's paying for it is one thing. If you need tin, and in other words, markets are not warfare; they're cooperation. But abuse of markets
Mhm.
is not cooperation; it's warfare. And so uh, you want to say you want to call warfare self-determination. I agree with you. It is self-determination, but it's self-determination that provokes retaliation. Anyway, I knew if I went down that rat hole, I would lose.
Okay, let's not go down that rat hole then, because we can you two can spend an hour and not getting any any agreement out of this.
I want to add that in the current world, every supposedly capitalistic democratic country is controlled by Jewish oligarchs, and China isn't. And if I had to select between the two, then Chinese model is a lesser evil.
Mm, I, I don't know whether I agree with that.
Yeah. So, all right, let's go with. I think it's every country is too heavily influenced by a financial sector that has been able to leverage fiat money for their benefit dominant against the majority of the population. I view that, and you have the people who have done it longest, the Jews, are obviously because they've been at it longer, better at it, and so they don't have any loyalty or compulsions to not prey upon the local on the people. So I agree with that's the case. But my belief is, as usual, whose fucking fault is that? The dog that barks, or the people who own the dog and don't train it to not bark incessantly. And my view is it's our problem. And I
Yeah,
think
I,
whenever you bring this up, my argument is you're just avoiding responsibility.
I agree it's our problem, but the problem is in the system we have adopted
Right.
because that allows them to do it.
It's just an increase in the scope of the law to fix it. That's all it is. Um, and it's
Okay,
and
so back to the question of law. Back to the original question, right? It's Kurt. You said you were thinking about this from the Muslim world perspective, i.e., those who adopted
no, no,
religion.
yes. So I'm going to describe it from the bottom up, like as if you're really backward,
Hmm.
right? I'm not going. In other words, Africa's not so much backward because it doesn't have a
It can't
structure.
even form a state.
It can't even form a state. So I'm going to take it from the Islam, uh, India, China,
Hmm.
all the way,
Hmm.
right? Um, and so I'm gonna have to look at my notes real quick here, but basically, when I say you have to go through it, is when you come up with your group strategy, you start out with the behavior, the resources, the competitors, right? The behavior, the resources, the competitors. right? And the resources is everything from what food, what animals, what climate, what geography, what rivers. You know, you
Also,
have
your people itself, the
uh,
carrier
yeah,
of the civilization, that's a
yes.
key resource.
And so I actually separate it as genetic capital from environmental capital.
Hmm.
So you have your genetic capital, right? Along with that, you have your behavioral capital. In your behavioral capital, you have stuff that's very important, which we're going to reduce to mythology, right? We don't tend, in our work, obviously in the grammars, we treat all systems of in reasonably consistent reasoning, right, or communication as a grammar, and so we're going to say that a group's strategy, group's evolutionary strategy, is embedded in a grammar called a mythology.
Hmm.
All right. Now that doesn't mean it's all fictional. It's just the broadest category that we can have. Do you think that I was thinking about this a lot yesterday? Confucius, what's his right? How do I say his name correctly?
Kongzi.
So,
Confucius.
so, so if I look at Confucius' work, you know, I was driving, I was thinking about this. And I was like, God damn, what a fucking genius! You know, it's different to look at Aristotle because he's talking about empiricism, right? And
Not really.
huh?
Not really. He made all sorts of claims
Trying,
that he never
trying,
tested.
because we're coming out of law, right? And he's trying. And I'm looking at Confucius and I'm like, fuck, the genius in that fucking guy is just amazing to me. Now I don't know how much, but it's really him, and afterwards it's sort of like European, you know, a lot of European stuff or Christian stuff. There's stuff added afterwards, but you know that's
Well, I
just
mean, we still have his supposedly his original teachings
yes,
captured in ancient Chinese. The versions that the English translation you see may have some Christian influence or whatever,
yeah.
but they're written records that can trace back to.
Right. So you read that stuff. You know, I look at so when I look at like Buddha, this is how I tend to look at the world,
Hmm.
and it's probably because of when I went to Catholic school, this is how we were taught. But I tend to look at it as Buddha, Confucius, and Aristotle,
Hmm.
right? Or Aristotle, Plato, the combination, right? That's how I tend to look it at the world. And I have those three because we were taught their life histories in high school, right? We were taught what they were doing, and whatever. It was called comparative religion. I'm like, well, it sounds like comparative philosophy to me, but but and so you're thinking about it, and you're like, God, that's amazing that they could do that at that time, and you realize, and it's the same thing when they bring up Egyptians. How could they build the pyramids? It's just fucking humans are the same. There's always some fucking genius around, right? They can do stuff. It's not. And a pyramid is just the most stable structure you can build other than a mound. Effectively, they started as mounds, right? That's how you start. You started any structure as a mound, and then you build it as a step, right? And then you cover the step with stone, right? And that's how
Okay,
things.
before you go too off track, so what was it about Confucius that you thought was brilliant?
Um, it's not it's not rationalism in the European logical
Hmm.
sense, like law. It's reasonableness, right? And it's reasonableness with riddles in particular, or problem solving. And I was actually thinking it's more. We actually train AIs more like that than we do train AIs with Socratic or not Socratic, with Aristotelian logic. And I was thinking how despite not how that's a logical system that is incredibly uh, that encourages the human mind to solve the riddle as a means of continuous reinforcement instead of memorization, which is the tendency of the logical model of the Western reasoning. Why am I going into this detail when I'm trying to get? I'm trying to get to the point of saying you have a mythology, right?
Hmm.
Which is you have circumstances, you have a genetic, right? You an environment, right? you have a gene pool. That gene pool is either less neotenous, African, Middle Eastern, or South Eurasian, and European or East Asian, right? You have a neotenous hierarchy there, right? You have a physical hardiness example, right? For the good step to it. And then you end up, because of neoteny, you end up with an IQ distribution, right? Which is basically related to the temperature zone, because the temperature zone puts pressure on you for that. And so you have these, so you have your environment, you have your genetic reserves, and then you have the mythology that people have, which is their group strategy, and you have the institutions that they develop. And so the institutions that they develop are really only three means of human influence to coercion. So you've got force defense, right? You've got what we call inclusion exclusion, which is really religion, and you've got trade or boycott, which is exchange, right? You've got these three forces. So you can bribe somebody, you can hurt somebody, you could threaten them with exclusion or social undermining, right? Or you can do the opposite. You can bring them in inclusion. You can trade with them. You can cooperate with them, and you can form defense or offense with them. So you only have these things, and so you end up with three basic institutions. You end up with you end up within the Middle East. The first one being the religion, because you have these waterways where groups have to cooperate together to produce irrigation, right? And so that's where you get, and you only get kings and states once you've become into conflict over water rights. In Europe, you've got access to technology coming out of these river valleys. It's making its way to you, but you don't have those rivers, right? And so Europeans develop really large cities, actually, through hunting, gathering, and then farming, right? Domestication and farming, right? Farming being late, because there were big cities in especially in Eastern Europe, as big as the Middle East, but they weren't made of anything durable. They were made of what was plentiful in Europe, which was wood. Right? And then you go into, what's the next easiest? Well, let's do the steppe because it's easy. Then you got someplace it's almost impossible to live because there's no fucking resources, no fucking rivers, except places where you can go hide. And until you get domesticated animals, right? But domesticated animals also always have to move. So you get steppe culture, right? Which never can develop anything substantive. I mean, for similar reasons, like you can't develop anything substantive in Africa. In Africa, population is dense and unorganizable, right? And in the steppe, population is scarce and unorganizable. So those two places were resistant to institutional formation. Then you go over to India. India had some promise, the Indus River Valley, not being that far from the Persian Gulf, or even the dry Persian Gulf, but the Persian Gulf. And they have their beautiful river systems. It takes more time to get that stuff going, but they seem to do pretty well. But it's a fucking huge place that's, I mean, it really was. India was a separate continent that actually slammed in, right? So it's actually somewhat of a separate continent on its own, and it has its own resources. It's kind of fucking hot, but they built a pretty good civilization there. But because of its scale and because it consisted of two demographic populations. Both apparently came out of what's Iran. I need better data on that. but you have the southern brown people, right, and the northern not so brown people, and it's 70% uh, lighter people in the north and 70% darker people in the south. And so there was really no ability because of this population distribution, the semi-continental nature of it, and the size. There was never any ability to really unite the thing. And so the best it got was feudal, all right? Um, and that's understandable because you're talking about very large territories without the ability to do what China did, which is form.
Unification of river valleys.
Correct. You just had this amazing success in China of a mixture of the right resources, the right rivers going in the right direction, multiple climates, and somewhat like India, not as successfully as India, basically an island because it's got oceans on one side and deserts and mountains on the others. So you had this civilization that had
an impassable tropical terrain, or at least back in the pre-industrial ages, separating from India.
Correct. And so, I mean, it's the same thing. We'd be in South America. We've still maintained that swath of South America that makes it hard to get from South America to North America.
Yeah.
Right? And so, when you look at India, they ended up with religion because that's the highest resolution. The people they could organize into any equivalent of a state.
Oh, I see. So the geography is one thing. The inability to form institution, any of the other two institutions to coerce people into cooperation is another factor. So in India, they couldn't quite form state because the rivers don't go in the same direction, and you have this varying degree of population that just can't really work all that well together. Unlike the steppe, you also don't get law because it's you can have feudalism, but they're not so mobile like you have in the steppes, and so therefore the only choice they have left is religion.
Yes, and they did. I mean, honestly, I think it's insane, but it's actually a fascinating religion because there's actually a cult for every class, almost every job, right? And so from a if you want to study it, not from how strange it is or whatever, just from how they managed to do that, it's fucking brilliant. And they actually had a good intellectual.
They found a place for everybody because nature can't starve and freeze people off, unlike Northeast Asia or something.
Yeah. And then they don't have the problem of the barbarians like China has, and so they didn't actually have the incentive
to form a strong state and protect the borders.
There was really no need. This led them to being conquered by the Indo-Europeans first, right? It led them being conquered by the gunpowder folk later on, and then by the English later on. But it's, I'm going to be harsh and say when you got a 75 IQ population, which maybe now is a 80 or 2 or something like that. I mean, the ruling classes had a fucking problem on their hands, and so they didn't have it's not like you could do what China could and or the West could, which is at least develop things locally. And then you get to China, which is of course interesting, is because they simply do have the problem. They do have rice, they do have rivers, they can afford to police it, they have a reason to they have an incentive to form a powerful state. They have an incentive to form a central state, an imperial state, just to be able to hold off the fucking barbarians who seem to come. It's my impression that this is a constant problem, or is it a problem of waves? In other words,
Was it Roger who talked about this? I mean, Roger basically likened these steppes as a area on the map that always spawns barbarians, and I think that's a very apt analogy, because back in the days when I was still playing this kind of games, there's the area of the map, it's unknown, and then once in a while, like this group, this herd of horsemen just comes out of there and start raiding your cities, right?
yeah,
I would say that the problem has always been there. And when the barbarian people, since the barbarian people, nomadics can't really develop their own technology, when they get in contact with river valley civilization like China that actually can develop technology, they adapt it and do a much better job with raiding and so on.
mm-hmm.
And so it's a constant tug of war of sorts.
Right. So it's not periodic; it's a continuous.
Right.
It's relatively continuous, right? So China gets, and so because of that, because of the combination of a good gene pool, a good product, rice is way better than wheat, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it also leads to Westerners having horses, and China not so much, right? So West had a huge number of horses per capita compared to China. So that leads to different things too. That leads to different distance problems and different warfare issues, etc. And so China has the rivers, they have the productivity of rice, they have a pretty awesome demographic distribution, and they have a huge geographic distribution to draw from, resources from, and they have a natural wall. And so when I look at it, you have all the things that are helpful in the origination of administration.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You have the ability to, you have an incentive, you have the ability to, you have rivers and transport means, so you can cheaply police areas. You can easily produce trade, so you need to have records, and as such, taxes, so you can have records. So you end up with being able to being in a pretty good circumstance to have the right combination of resources and pressures to bring about the centralized state. So I mean, if you go to Europe, Europe is actually a product of both the forests and the steppe. You have the steppe invent rule of law, right? Basically, contractualism, or the kind of rule pirates use, which we call democracy, but it really should be called rule of law. And they come in and they conquer. They come and conquer in all of Europe, and they take it over. And but Europe can't get the position that China or India or the Fertile Crescent can, which is that they have no way. They have rivers, but none of them are
rivers going different directions, leaving different seas, and it's covered basically all forests.
Forests, and so you don't have this ability to create large states. They've tried repeatedly, but you can't. It's very hard to do it. And the people in them have a tradition of this independence, right? Mm-hmm. Their own tribal independence, and they have a continuous state of war because they were organized, unlike the Middle East, bottom up by priests and then by the military conquerors. They were tribally run as war bands, right? And so they start out with the capacity to produce warriors, right? And so warriors with metal and horses and wheels are scary fuckers. So, it was very difficult for tribes to conquer others. It was more like they had to ask for permission to go through someone's land to get someone. People resettled all the time, mm-hmm. Right? And so Europe developed its. Then Europe gets down into the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean, Greece in particular, comes into contact with the Egyptians, who have advanced trade. They learn a lot from them. the why do I want to say Polynesians? The people in who run Carthage. What are they called?
The red what?
The people who run Carthage. The what?
Carthaginians?
No, the
Phoenicians.
what? Why can't I say this? The original script? What is wrong with me this morning?
Linear B? No.
Oh, that's in fuck. What? So were the Carthaginians? I'm gonna feel so stupid. I can hear the audience laughing at me.
Zach says Phoenicians.
Phoenicians, thank you. Fuck. So the Phoenicians are around, and the Phoenicians, of course, develop a more useful and system of writing, and so they get that. And so between these two things, or these two groups, they are now introduced to sea trade instead of raiding, farming, trading, and raiding. They're introduced to sea trade, and sea trade is incredibly valuable. And so you have the rise of the Mediterranean Europeans, the Greeks in particular, but at the time, what we consider Greece is also Eastern Anatolia, Western Anatolia, right? It's actually the whole waterway there, it's the coast of Anatolia as well as
Yep. Modern day Turkey, no.
Yep.
Because you have Greek colonies across the strait.
Correct. And of course, at the time, the people who are occupying Anatolia are the Hatti, right? And so they're basically the same gene pool, right? They're mixture of European, Southeastern European, and so you have the Indo-Europeans from there over, and so they do pretty well until the Great Collapse, right? The Sea Peoples, and so Europeans start out with their method, and they develop a rule of law. So you have these 3 points, right? You have the Middle East with religion, you have the Europeans with law, and you have the Chinese with state, and everybody's somewhere on that diagram, because it's the only you start out with an institution, it becomes your dominant institution. Then you come up with your next institution, it becomes your second, and your third institution is weak or failed. So the Middle East can barely produce a state and can't produce law. China can produce a hell of a state. It produced command law, which is not rule of law, but command
Rule
law.
by law.
Right, rule by law.
Yeah.
And then you had essentially the religion is weak. It's basically not administratively necessary, and so you end up with a pretty useful structure there. In Europe, we start out with the law, then we get the state, and then we get religion. So we're similar to China, and that religion is low on the authority list. And so what do you do to change that? How do you change something that's entrenched, right? Because it's not, when we say metaphysics, I actually hate the word, but it's the only term we have, but it means the assumptions you make about the reality, right? And so cultures have all these layers of assumptions built out of their myths. It's not taught like science, it's just taught like how things are done, or in myths or stories or legends or habits and norms and traditions and institutions. So it's all out there. So let me see if I've covered this here. So what do you have to change? All right. So so basically, let's start from behavior, right? Let's stick with the genetic and behavioral core, right? The change is only viable if the population composition changes.
Population composition changes.
Right. Demographic shift, gene flow, natural selection.
Sure. So you essentially you change your genetic capital as a form
Right.
as a source,
Right.
as a resource. I mean,
Right.
but I guess one thing that I'm trying to get over or trying to decide, and I can't quite decide, is if I follow David Lin's theory, then your genetic capital as a resource essentially came out as a evolutionary outcome based on the geography that the people evolved in.
Yeah, but we think like we're not positive, but it looks like East Asian geography came out of the Tibetan plateau, not out
Right.
of the coast.
Well, that's what I mean, right?
Yep.
When you're on the Tibetan plateau, you have to be pretty smart to survive the winter.
No shit. So you're
And-
going somewhere with that? Yeah.
Right. So then, in that sense, in the long term, geography and climate is such a immovable, almost glacial-like force that shapes the people who live there throughout the generations.
Yes.
So then, even if you can change, let's say that somehow by magic the Chinese are transported to Middle East and occupies all of the Middle East. I think in a couple of thousand years, the Chinese are going to degrade to what the Middle East is now.
It doesn't appear so.
It would
Because
certainly be an improvement.
Okay.
it doesn't appear so. Because what you do find the selection process there is for a slower metabolism to compensate for the heat.
Hmm.
But it's very there's I don't see any incentive for lower IQ. I don't see why that would happen. And if anything, I would think the process would continue. In other words, I don't think there's if you move Europeans into South America, their IQ doesn't decrease. If you move Chinese around the world, their IQ doesn't decrease.
Well, based on the evidence you're basing on is only a couple hundred years. I'm talking about thousands.
Okay.
And forecasting into the future, and when and if we start colonizing different planets, so let's say there's a planet occupied by the Chinese with geography similar to that of a steppe, does that mean that in a few thousand years, in the distant 41st millennium, the Chinese are going to develop rule of law as the interstellar Chinese are going to develop rule of law as founding institution? So
What's 6 generations?
You're ignoring the feedback loop, though, because populations, based on their group strategy, also transform the environment around them.
Yes.
There are certain environments that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to transform. Like, how do you make all the rivers in Europe flow in the same direction? You can't. Not based on our development, it's technology anyway.
I don't know whether to keep going with this or not.
Yeah, I'm just like that's why I asked this question in the first place. I can't figure out whether it's
There's no reason for humans. The reason Africa didn't evolve so fast isn't just the climate. It's because there was no possible means of isolation and speciation. What happened is the world as we went around the world, yeah, there was selection pressure, but it was selection pressure during isolation that's sufficient to produce speciation. So groups of people tend to regress to the mean. In other words, of the populations that exist. So if you go out into the world. What our ancestors did is specifically from 70,000 to 10,000 years ago, probably less, 70,000 to to 25,000 years ago. So over that 50,000 year period, there was a lot of natural selection going on because there was a lot of isolation and speciation. But even still, we only ended up with a few races. We have ethnic groups within races. We only really had 4 major speciation events, and that's because we had to have with small populations invading new climates, the geographies. But I mean, there is evidence of going backward. Australians Australians went backwards, right? So I don't. It's not that you're wrong, right? It's like backwards from where? Like I mean, it's kind of hard to see an average 106, 110 IQ population going backward versus an 84 IQ population going backward. Those are two pretty different things. And so I'm not arguing that I'm right. I'm arguing it. I see a lot more tendency of regression to the mean when it's you start from a higher position. When you start from a lower IQ, I can see less chance of regression to the mean. In other words, less chance. That's wrong way to look at it. Less natural reinforcement of the mean, precisely because IQ is just so valuable. But once you're down there in the 70s and 60s, you're not talking about I mean, we consider people, Europeans and East Asians with IQs we consider them mentally disabled.
I guess going back to my original question, the conclusion based on all this last half an hour discussion is, unless you can somehow change what's the word you use, the myth of a civilization.
Yes.
Right, which is essentially propagation of your civilization by mimetic means.
Yes.
Unless you can fundamentally change that somehow, that civilization cannot really unanchor from its funding institution.
It's not cannot. So I got some notes here, okay? So the example I used was China, right? China could adopt rule of law only if the party collapses or reforms under economic duress. Right? The middle class demands procedural protections as a survival strategy. In other words, under duress. A new elite emerges from within or abroad to institutionalize a new grammar of cooperation. In other words, a new ideology. It would be means of migrating the present civilizational model and strategy to a new one, which is what happened with the Marxists, right? And the shift is mythologized as harmony under law rather than defection from harmony. In other words, it would have to fulfill the harmony mission because it's almost impossible to imagine the leap, that metaphysical leap in China, especially given the size of the population and its breadth. So to me, I can, we can't say it can't happen because for all intents and purposes, the communists all but destroyed traditional Chinese society. We know it can happen because the Indo-Europeans came in and did their thing. We know Islam destroyed 7 civilizations of the ancient world and reduced them to ignorance and decline. So we know that it's possible. The question is, do people do it without duress?
I don't think people will change without duress.
Exactly. And so without duress, people won't do it. So what has to happen is the civilization has to reach an evolutionary failure point where it can no longer preserve its status quo or will fall behind neighboring status quos if it doesn't change. And so and if that's the case, if the incentive exists, in other words, the incentive exists, we're seeing it happen in Islam right now. It's kind of fascinating. I think we need to get Islam out of Europe and put it back to where it's home, and then there's more chance they'll reform.
You made me realize that China actually did reach that failure point starting in the 1840s.
Yes.
Right, was a modern state, i.e., England, with rule of law, being able to essentially conquer China to an extent, and then the Chinese civilization reached that failure point, and then for the next 100 years, somehow, like call it roll of dice or whatever, somehow it actually got afflicted with communism, which is a Middle Eastern Semitic religion. And it, unfortunately, that became the outcome. But that duress the period duress has not yet finished. Because I don't think the CCP or this Semitic religion as a way of organizing society I don't see it lasting another 150 years and going out of its live out its 250-year empire cycle.
Yeah, I can't see who. Yeah, the empire cycle is a great way of saying it. I can't remember who. I mean, I can see the guy talking, and I can't remember his name.
Zihan?
Sorry?
Peter Zihan?
No, this is a proper intellectual. He's lived in Hong Kong a lot of his life, but he's Dutch.
Oh, Decoder or something?
Yeah, it's something like that.
Yeah, he wrote the liberation, like that. He wrote a book about the first 10 years after liberation. I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, he says, look, it takes 3 generations for people to recognize the failure and do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same generational argument everybody else. Right? And so the first generation is devoted, right? The second becomes aware of the limits, and the third fights for, and the third is the last one that is willing to preserve it. And so the 4th generation causes the refresh. So he says basically these things. He says China is only a generation behind the Russians.
Right, because my parents' generation, the baby boomers, they're still often most of them are still brainwashed by the system. My generation, by the time it gets to Gen Xers, we realize something is wrong, but there's too few of us to do anything about it.
Yeah. Yes.
The millennials is also the equivalent of millennials in China, i.e., those born in after 1980s till about the year 2000, are also a smaller generation. Although we're getting population collapse and so on, so it's just every generation just gradually gets smaller. So we're talking about essentially the Gen Zs of China, if they wake up from the slumber or whatever, they're the ones that are actually going to make change.
Yes.
Waking up doesn't do anything if you don't have a competing elite that can mobilize a population.
I mean, that's the virtue of the tombstones. It maybe the civilizations only progress with tombstones, but it may also be that thank God there are tombstones so that civilizations can progress.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the old. I mean, China's getting to be where half the population is effectively old. So I mean, it's not the ability for the older generations to hold power against the younger generations for infinite period of time. No, it has to be incentives. So I don't know. I want to stay out of a war with China, and if we can, then I think things will work out just fine. But Z is apparently devoted to having this happen. He did a number on the military last couple of weeks. So
well, according to some news, he no longer holds the military. He used to
know.
be the head of all three branches, and now he's
Right.
only left with a party.
Right, and what I don't know if this is true. So, but my understanding is we don't know if it's his people that are trying to clean up the military or the opposition's cleaning up the military of his people.
I think the latter is probably
You think
more
it's
true.
the latter? Yeah.
And the question is whether such reform would be into something that's actually in the interest of Chinese people or just another country in the globalist system.
The desire to maintain the integrity of the country is rational, especially given the distribution of wealth between the coasts and the interior. It's not, it's similar to the United States saying, secession is a great idea, as long as it's other people succeeding from their governments, because the continental United States is too strategically valuable to allow competitors onto. So secession is not. Devolution is probably acceptable, but secession is not. So I suspect I can't see China ever thinking otherwise. What I don't understand is why they were so afraid of. I mean, other than protecting their privilege, I don't understand why they were so afraid of democracy there. I just don't get it. Maybe
Let's not use the dirty word. Rule of law.
rule of law. Okay. Yeah, I can't keep saying that. We talk about democracy, but actually, it's actually rule of law that matters, not democracy.
Democracy is just a code for globalism.
Yes, well, I don't know. Martin, you're such a really good dissident right activist. Always making sure that the point is being made.
Well, it doesn't seem to stick, so.
You gotta stay on it.
All right. Do we have time for one more?
I don't know what time is it.
Oh,
All right, so why not? I think we did a good job on that one.
Yes, very thorough. Okay, so next one hopefully will be a quick one. So, question 5. Was the 90s the best decade of recent culture, and why?
Absolutely. Am I answering this?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you had the end of the Soviet Union and the end of the fear of being blown up by nuclear weapons. That was really, you can't really, I mean, the relief we felt at that time, you can't explain to people because there's no equivalent of it. But knowing that was over was fantastic. The second thing is China came online and started producing goods that were cheap. And so, right, the government had decided that they needed to get more of us into houses so that we would vote responsibly. So they built up that. And so you had this amazing flourishing and it coincided with the tech boom. So you had the tech boom come out, the internet come out. You had the internet really made it's a huge fucking difference. And it was just this. It was a post-war feeling around everywhere. If matter of fact, because we're out here now. I mean, if you lived in Seattle in the 90s, it was an amazing place to be in human history. We had not suffered the problems of most immigrant cities. We didn't. We had almost no black population, so we didn't have any hangovers from the civil rights nonsense. We had a pretty good artistic community, which I was involved in, and producing all sorts of stuff. We had a cute little downtown that people cared about. I mean, how many people today take this Seattle Underground tour versus back in the 90s, right? And there was so much fucking money floating around because of Microsoft. It was just insane. So we had restaurants and entertainment places and all sorts of. We had. It was just a flourishing, a flourishing of positive stuff. So people talk about Paris in the 20s as being probably one of the best places to live in human history. I certainly think Seattle in the 90s is equivalent to Paris in the 20s. It's not a smaller city, but it was certainly that good. And we had stupid stuff like when you have CD players, right, and VCRs, you actually can consume 100 years of media
Mm-hmm.
in a decade, right? I mean, and that happened, right? So we had people doing home improvements, taking out housing loans. I mean, it was just crazy all around. And we had a foolish government that thought that the Cold War, now that the Cold War was over, it was back to liberal universal growth and peace and prosperity, and everything was be warm and fuzzy again. I mean, the '90s were freaking awesome. Personally, I remember the shift very clearly that started around the time of Star Wars in '70s. Was it '77 or '79? I can't remember what it was.
Mm-hmm.
The shift happens with Reagan, but it happens around. It actually happens around Star Wars because it's enough time after Vietnam and enough time into the beginning of the computer revolution that the world once Reagan got into place and Grenada went through, so that Americans had gotten over the Vietnam hangover. Uh, the music changed, everything changed. Thank God disco went away. Jesus Christ, if it was a monster, I would have gone to kill it myself. Um, Matter of fact, most of the '70s music is shit. So anyway, so we go. So it was just a general release. So we're in the '80s. It's starting to feel good. Yeah, there's the Challenger disaster and a few other things, but essentially we're starting to feel good. And then you have the breakup of the Soviet Union, and that is we're feeling good. And then we have China coming online as a producer, which means goods got cheaper. That was really weird, by the way. I was writing a lot about that at the time. Like, why can't I get a German quality stereo anymore? Because the Japanese and Chinese have
Mm-hmm.
saturated it with stuff that's equally good, not as pretty, but equally good for a third of the price, right? And so we have all this entertainment going on in the '90s, and we have the internet taking off, and the computer revolution is really going nuts. I mean, I don't know if people remember today what it was like before Windows 3.1, how hard it was
Oh
to make.
yeah, DOS 5.2 or DOS 5.1 and so
But
on.
the minute you get Windows 3.1 and you've got networking, holy shit, the world just changed overnight. And so, then we got up, then we get into the processing power and whatever that approaches 2000. And so right up until 2000, it was pretty freaking good. 2001 was a bitch because we had both the market correction and 9/11. That was a
Mm-hmm.
shock. I didn't think we'd recover from it very well. I was kind of surprised that the aughts were anywhere near as good as they were. But and certainly after 2008, it went downhill, and it's continued to go downhill relatively since then. But certainly the '90s were the high point of any point since the '20s. Absolutely, no question about it. Um, the '50s were good, but at the time, the post-war hangover and the nuclear threat was not very comfortable to live through, and that is part of the reason for the optimism of the '50s is to counter the post-war hangover and the new emerging threat. Um, but we were a more integrated society then, and a more harmonious society then. Um, by the Jewish Marxist invasion happened in the '50s, and it had enough control to create the horrors that the left unfortunately thinks were goods. the 1960s, and the their intentional dilution of the population since then. So, but the 90s were certainly the best time. I couldn't believe it because I was in high school in the 70s, right? Late 70s, and I was in college until 83. And so when I was in high school, 40% of kids, college graduates, weren't getting jobs. Fucking China. It's like China is today. Half the kids graduate college, they can't find a job. Well, I mean, we had 40% of us graduating college. The only reason I really went into engineering was because I wanted to be able to get a job on the other side. Otherwise, I would have just gone into science. Right. So yeah, I don't know how it gets better. As a matter of fact, I remember my grandmother saying at the time, I don't know how old she was. She must have been closing in on 100. Is that she said, I think I've seen the best it will ever be. I don't think going forward from here will be as good as what I've seen.
So your grandmother was born in the late 1800s.
Yeah, just after 1900. Yeah.
Oh, just after 1900. Well, that's the same age as my grandfather.
Yeah. I think that's right. Yeah, in 1902 or something like that. I remember. And she's like, so she was just, they had horses and carriages, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They went through what else was it? Scarlet? They painted the red X on your door if you had the was it scarlet flu? Was it scarlet fever? Whatever it was.
I don't know anything about it.
Right. So I mean, in the early 1900s, that flu went around the world. The Spanish flu, I guess it was.
Oh yeah.
So neighbors would deliver stuff at the end of your driveway, and then you would go pick it up for you, and you would leave it on your mailbox, which you needed, or at the end of your driveway, and then your neighbors would do the shopping for you, and that kind of thing. And so people were dropping like flies, and you go from that to the arrival of the automobile.
I mean, I think what's amazing is people born in the early 1900s, the turn of the century, they went from horse-drawn buggies to first manned flight to all the way landing on the moon.
Yes.
It's ridiculous.
So, today, I'm not sure, I'm having trouble, and I'd love you to opine on this, but I can't tell. There's something bad about people not socializing as much. In other words, people are in front of these things too much. I noticed that. I know that much. And people are saturated with negative news a lot. So I'm not some of our guys have a good touch on the public, and I don't, right? I mean, I don't have any feel for that at all. But it seems to me that there's we're sort of living in a bit of an illusion from information saturation that I can't tell of how much meaning it has. Like the need to reorganize the world, which I think I wrote about yesterday. We might have mentioned that. The need to reorganize the world is real. The threat to us if we don't reorganize the world is pretty bad. But aside from that, is it the fact that men and women aren't getting along and getting married and having kids? That's pretty fucking bad. I mean, it not only doesn't give us enough people, it makes unhappy people, and it depresses consumption significantly, so that it depresses growth, right? Which means that our ability to have surpluses, right, to do anything with, whether you think about it as retirement or healthcare or whatever the fuck, that's being caught by at least a third, if not a half, by the fact that simply nothing other than people aren't getting married at 21 to 22 and having kids right away. where they tried to support it, offset it with immigration, it turns out that immigrants are a third less productive when we only produce 20% surpluses. So, I mean, immigrants are a net loss despite what they promised us. They keep lying to us about. So, I don't mean all immigrants. You know what immigrants I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know.
Um, so when I look at this, I'm like, well, we're not in a very good shape right now, and we're not in a good shape because the progressives were optimistic and the conservatives failed to constrain them. I mean, that's the real reality of it. It's nothing that good, and conservatives are fucking Christian optimists, which is foolish, and they should be more like Martin. And what they did is they said they'll learn. That's what I was brought up thinking.
No.
These poor communists, these poor leftists, they'll learn and they'll grow up and they'll become wise adults like we are.
Yeah,
That didn't happen.
And I see it wasn't some naivety, it was entirely intentional.
they will only they will only learn if conservatives or the responsible male stop providing buffer between them and natural consequences.
Correct. Which is Luke's whole thing, right? All right.
The main thing is we get rid of enemies who control the system. They don't want us to be succeeding. They don't want people breeding. That's the primary cause of everything else.
Well, people aren't breeding, and that means there's no surplus for the state to redistribute to buy loyalties with.
I don't view that as primary issue at all.
Well, I mean, if
Issue for themselves.
but what evidence do we have that the left is very bright, Martin? I mean, you look at these people.
I don't mean the pawns. I mean those that created the narrative for them and created the incentives.
But see, here's the thing, and this is the part that I can't get over my head. Are they really that stupid? In the sense that I can't imagine them being stupid. Because any parasite's goal is not to kill the host. The parasite's goal is to keep the host going.
That's how conservatives think. Conservatives think about time consequences. Progressives think about experiences. They don't actually think about it. I'm not even sure they can think about it. When I play this game with people, anytime I can get a progressive to talk to me about anything important, they don't talk about consequences. They're just like the female intuition. They don't realize what they're really saying is men will take care of it. The left does the exact same thing.
But I don't mean the pawns on the left. I'm talking about, like Martin said, right?
They actually think that well, I mean, in the case of the Jewish left that Mark's talking about, they just want to rule because they have they claim a superiority. They have an inferiority complex.
They want everyone else exterminated or enslaved.
Right, because they're not competent. But that's just an application of the female mind. So I'm going to go back to it. It's just we're expecting too much for them to be. It's like asking a blind person to see colors. They're not going to.
Okay, I suppose that I'm too naive. Because it's like, you can't be that stupid.
Yeah, you can. You can be that colorblind, right? Because it's actually a valence, right? What is your mind? What is your brain organized to do? It's organized, right?
To filter out information.
What?
Your brain's organized to actually filter out information.
Right. It's filter out information necessary for you to achieve the things to which you attach valence. So what does the empathic mind attach valence to? Experience. What does the systemic mind attach valence to? Outcomes. Right? And so it's like trying to get a dog not to sniff butts. They're not going to stop doing it because that's what their brain's organized to. I did that just to get a reaction out of you. I'm sorry.
No, it's not just that. It's their ideology, their group strategy. that tells them there
Well, but
is.
the group strategy is just a measure of their selection by valence. I mean, this is.
No, it's not just that. It's.
I know it's not just that. You and I are going to have this conversation again, where I'm like, I start with first principles and you don't, right? And you do when it's you in your interest because you said something very smart yesterday. But I start with first principles, so I reduce things to first principles. Is that the only thing? No, but the rest of the things are still consequences of the first principle. Their ideology exists to fulfill the valence, which is the ability to obtain status and consumption with the minimum effort involved by the use of appeal to emotion, right? So they're trying to organize by short-term valence instead of long-term valence. Valence, which is why we vary more than they do, because over time has more permutations than in time does. It's I don't know. I see all of human behavior as a thin pretense of linguistic consciousness over a deterministic biological clock, and I think that's probably, and with the very few of us who are the kind of clocks that seek valence over long periods of time, the ones that just happen to be smarter because we were born this way.
The disagreement is that I don't see that the first principle of feminine cognition would necessarily lead them to develop the way they did. But there's a lot of self-imposed selection pressures that led them there.
There's a lot of internal, their own selection pressure, their selection bias in them, and there are other people like them that are creating selection pressure, and people above them that create idea networks in order to be able for people below them to organize to produce selection pressure so that people execute selection bias. I mean, there's nothing even interesting about it. It's so simple. What's fascinating is the capacity of the human mind to invent excuses and stories and whatever in order to say, I want. And, and the fact that men won't control the consumption of the children, which is what the feminine mind is, because the purpose of the feminine mind is to bridge between the child and the adult. So, I mean, okay, fine,
I agree all about feminine mind. I just don't think that necessitates the feminine population would turn out supremacist.
I don't translate everyone. I'm saying that given its own given a lack of constraints, it will go to its, which is what we see everywhere. If we see the feminine unbound from its constraints, we will see what we see in every developed country. If we take the masculine unbound from its constraints, we will see it tolerate this bullshit from the feminine. Right? And so the problem with wealth, the problem with democracy, and the problem with whatever is it gives freedom to our instincts without limitations on their negative expressions by whether direct or indirect.
The problem is that men are constrained too much, because men that are on constraints are constraining others.
Yeah, but what you're saying they're constrained too much is that's the elimination of the constraint on men to constrain the feminine. So
and each other.
Same argument.
Okay, I think that's a good note to end on.
You didn't jump in on that.
No, because there's no need for me to.
Okay, fine. No fun. I was like, I keep thinking about this. These are much more interesting when you have a debate. It's the same shit. I remember when one of the television networks came to us and said, we have this idea of whatever, and I'm like, nobody's gonna do it. Nobody's gonna pay attention to you, and it's because the only reason people pay attention is moral outrage. You have to create a conflict so that people feel compelled to pay attention to a thing they wouldn't normally pay attention to, and so you're not creating any conflict, so you're not going to generate any eyeballs. And they were like, of course, they're proper liberals, right? They're probably the higher word liberals. And they have a fucking conniption on it. I'm not going to be wrong. There's zero chance I'm going to be wrong. Find me some evidence out there that it's not, and it's not going to be the case. The reason you get eyeballs is the same reason the press goes negative and plays its sedition and moral is that they're looking for a way to generate moral outrage because that is the most likely means by which they're capturing human attention. And if they capture human attention, they can get advertisers. Duh, right? And so, what's the real problem? The real problem is we don't tell people they have to testify that when they're talking to the public in public about matters public that they're subject to testimony, so they can't do that. Well, if we did that, then there would be, instead of being 12 million reporters, there'd be like 10, because that's the total number of people who can speak honestly in the country at any given time. All right, I'll shut up now. I'm getting a look from Francis again.
No, I was going to say outro.
All right, what am I supposed to do?
I just conclude like you do the intro, and then I'll finish with.
Yeah. You meant you're going to say do the outro, not outro. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Do the outro.
Okay. So this is Francis Martin and Curt, the Natural Law Institute. Today's Friday, April 4th, 2025. We did how many questions today?
5.
5 questions, as usual. Enjoyed them. Please, Francis puts the link to submit your questions below. Hopefully, usually Martin puts an answer for them. And then I try to jump off whatever Martin does. All right. Thank you very much. You guys are great.
Like, bell, and subscribe.
Yes. Like, bell, and subscribe. Okay. Martin, anything? You wave goodbye? Like, can you wave goodbye? Yeah, there we go. We got emotional expression. I love you guys. Have a great day.
See y'all. Bye.